The judge mocks a teen in court, minutes later. The truth leaves him stunned. Welcome back to Meaningful Stories. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and start the story right now. The air inside the Los Angeles County Courthouse hung heavy, thick with the stale scent of old wood and whispered secrets. As if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Rows of spectators packed the gallery, their restless murmurs buzzing like a swarm of wasps, eyes glinting with curiosity and judgment. At the heart of it all stood Judge Walter Grayson, perched high on his bench like a vulture surveying its prey, his gavel resting in his hand like a loaded gun. His gaze, sharp, cold, and tinged with arrogance, sliced through the room, landing on the lone figure at the defendant's table, Jalen Dawson. All of 19 years old. Accused of grand theft auto and resisting arrest. The charges crackled in the air like static before a storm, serious. Damning. The kind that could bury a kid like him under the weight of a prison sentence. But Jalen didn't cower. He stood there, hands shoved deep in his pockets. Chin tilted just enough to defy the gravity of the moment. The oversized table dwarfed him, its polished edge gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. But he didn't shrink. He looked small. Sure, too small for the spotlight, but there was a spark in his stance. A quiet fire that flickered beneath the surface. Unnoticed by the room. Not yet. Grayson leaned back in his chair, the creak of leather echoing like a warning shot. His fingers drummed a lazy, deliberate rhythm against the desk. Each tap a taunt, a countdown. He peered over the rim of his glasses, lips curling into a smirk that was half sneer, half challenge. You think you're some kind of legal expert? Huh? His voice dripped with dry amusement, slicing through the tension like a blade. This isn't a debate club, kid. A ripple of chuckles erupted, sharp, mocking, from the bailiff, the stenographer, the prosecutor perched at his table like a smug cane. They were all in on it. A pack of hyenas circling what they thought was easy meat. The gallery shifted, a sea of faces leaning forward, hungry for the kill. They saw what Grayson saw, just another troubled teen. Another name on a docket. Another story destined to end in cuffs and regret. The room pulsed with anticipation. The kind that precedes a slaughter. But Jalen didn't flinch. His eyes, dark, steady, unreadable, locked onto the judge. And for a fleeting second, something unspoken passed between them. Grayson didn't see it, didn't feel it. He was too busy flipping open the case file with a theatrical sigh. Too certain this would be over before his golf game at 2. The audience snickered again, oblivious to the storm brewing in the silence. Because Jalen wasn't laughing. He wasn't trembling. He was waiting. And in that thick, suffocating air, beneath the weight of 100 staring eyes, the real trial was about to begin, not the one written in the charges. But the one Grayson didn't even know he'd stepped into. Jalen Dawson wasn't born in the shadow of the courthouse. But he might as well have been. While other kids chased fleeting glory on cracked basketball courts or lost themselves in the neon glow of video games, Jalen was forging a different path, one carved in the flickering light of his mother's desk lamp. Surrounded by the ghosts of trials past, Denise Dawson, a paralegal with 20 years etched into the lines of her face, brought home more than just stories. She carried battle scars from a war most never saw, the quiet, grinding clash of a justice system that chewed up lives and spat out verdicts. And Jalen? He drank it all in like a parched man at a well. Every word, every detail, every bitter truth. By the time he was 14, the kid had turned his mind into a weapon. Case law wasn't just words on a page, it was ammunition. Each precedent a bullet he tucked away for a fight he didn't yet know he'd face. While his friends memorized jump shots and cheat codes, Jalen memorized rulings, Miranda, Gideon, Brady, names that echoed like war cries in his head. Alone in his room, he'd pace the worn carpet, shadowboxing with imaginary prosecutors, dismantling their arguments with a precision that would have made a law professor sweat. The courtroom wasn't a distant dream, it was a battlefield he'd already mapped out. Every corner, every trap, every weak spot burned into his brain. Denise's voice was his war drum, steady and unrelenting. She'd sit at the kitchen table, papers strewn like a general's battle plans, recounting how prosecutors twisted facts like knotted rope, how judges perched on their benches played favorites with a flick of their gavels, how some defense attorneys stumbled through cases like drunks in the dark. Jalen listened, His small frame hunched over a chipped mug of coffee. Absorbing it all, he saw the cracks in the system, gaping. Jagged fissures where the innocent slipped through and the guilty walked free. He learned its rhythm, its pulse, its lies. By the time he stood in that courtroom, he wasn't just a kid in trouble. He was a soldier armed to the teeth with knowledge most law students couldn't dream of grasping. But to Judge Grayson, none of that mattered. Not yet. To him, Jalen was just another shadow in the dock. Another faceless name on a rap sheet. Another domino waiting to fall. The old man couldn't see the fire smoldering beneath that hoodie. Couldn't hear the ticking of a mind that had spent years preparing, not for this exact moment. No, Jalen hadn't planned to be the one in chains, but for the war he'd always known was coming. He'd never wanted to stand here as a defendant. But now that he was, the stakes were higher than Grayson could fathom. This wasn't just a trial. It was the opening shot of a reckoning. And Jalen was ready to fire. The courtroom pulsed like a living thing. Its heartbeat a low, menacing hum as Mitchell Carrington rose from his seat. A predator in a crisp suit. His tie knotted tight like a noose. The prosecutor's shadow stretched long across the polished floor. His every step a deliberate strike. His polished shoes clicking like the hammer of a gun being cocked. He carried the air of a man who'd already won. His voice rolling out with the oily confidence of a seasoned executioner delivering a death blow. "Your Honor," he began, his words slicing through the thick air. "The state will prove, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that Jalen Dawson was caught red-handed." Hands wrapped around the wheel of a stolen 2022 Audi A6. A sleek beast reported missing mere hours before his arrest. The gallery leaned forward, a pack of wolves scenting blood. Their whispers rising like a wind before a storm. Carrington's eyes gleamed as he turned to the jury. His stack of papers a weapon he wielded with surgical precision. Officers chased him through the neon veins of downtown. Tires screaming, lights flashing, until he tried to vanish into the night, only to be dragged into custody. Fingerprints smeared across the steering wheel like a signature on a confession. The words landed hard, each one a brick in the wall he was building around Jalen. A fortress of guilt that seemed unshakable. The evidence gleamed in the courtroom's harsh light. A stolen car. A reckless chase. A suspect cornered. Damning. Ironclad. Or so it seemed. Judge Grayson lounged in his perch. A king on his throne. His fingers tracing lazy circles on the desk as if he were already mentally swinging a golf club. He glanced at Jalen over the rim of his glasses. His smirk a blade glinting in the sun. "Go on," he drawled, his voice a bored rumble. As if the verdict was already etched in stone. Carrington obliged, striding toward the jury box like a general claiming conquered ground. His polished veneer unshaken. "The defense might spin you a fairy tale," he said, his tone dripping with scorn. "Paint Mr. Dawson as some poor soul caught in a twist of fate. But let's cut through the smoke." He pivoted sharply, locking eyes with Jalen for the first time. A hunter sizing up his prey. What kind of innocent man bolts from the police? The question hung in the air, heavy as a guillotine's blade, and the room seemed to tighten around it. Grayson leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand, his gaze narrowing as if savoring the kill. The gallery buzzed louder, a hive of anticipation, every eye darting between the prosecutor's swagger and the kid in the hoodie who hadn't moved. Hadn't blinked. Carrington flipped through his notes with a flourish, his voice rising. "Your Honor, I present Officer Daniel Ruiz's testimony." He saw Dawson behind the wheel with his own eyes before the chase erupted. The car was stolen. The arrest was clean. The facts don't lie. Grayson exhaled through his nose. A slow, satisfied hiss, nodding as if the case were already a corpse laid out before him. "Sounds straightforward to me," he muttered, his words a gavel's echo waiting to fall. The room seemed to agree. Spectators nodded. Jurors shifted. The bailiff's lips twitched with a smirk. On the surface, it was a slaughter, a stolen Audi, a desperate flight, fingerprints like chains. But Jalen stood still, a statue in the storm, his silence louder than the prosecutor's thunder. He didn't flinch, didn't falter. His eyes tracked Carrington's every move, sharp as a blade's edge. Because he'd seen this play before. He knew the script, and he knew where the cracks hid. The courtroom held its breath, a coiled spring ready to snap. As Jalen Dawson stepped into the fray, the murmurs died. swallowed by a silence so sharp it could cut glass. Judge Grayson's smirk froze mid-curl. His gavel hovering like a hawk stalled in mid-flight. When Jalen's voice, calm, steady, a blade wrapped in velvet, pierced the stillness. "I'll be representing myself, Your Honor." The words detonated like a grenade. Shards of shock rippling through the room. The bailiff's jaw dropped. A cartoonish gape. The stenographer's fingers faltered over her keys, and Mitchell Carrington's polished smirk flickered. A candle caught in a gust. Before he barked a laugh, sharp, brittle, a crack in his armor. "This should be interesting," he sneered, but the edge in his voice betrayed him. The gallery erupted in a low roar, a tide of whispers crashing against the walls, as every eye locked onto the kid in the hoodie who just turned the game upside down. Grayson blinked, leaning forward, his amusement now a mask stretched thin over something darker, curiosity. Maybe, or the first flicker of doubt. "You'll what?" he rumbled. The question a thunderclap rolling over the room. Jalen didn't waver. "I'll be defending myself," he repeated, his tone a quiet storm. Hands still buried in his pockets like a gunslinger hiding his draw. The air thickened, electric, as he took his first step forward. A lone figure against a sea of suits and gavels. The laughter faded, the hyenas stopped circling, because something had shifted, something no one could name yet. But they felt it, a tremor beneath their feet. Jalen let the silence stretch. A predator stalking its moment. Then struck. "Your Honor, before I begin, I'd like to confirm something with the prosecution." Carrington raised an eyebrow, arms crossed like a shield, his confidence a crumbling fortress. "Go ahead," he snapped, impatience dripping from the words. Jalen's lips twitched, just a hint, a spark, before he fired. "You said Officer Daniel Ruiz personally saw me behind the wheel before I was arrested. Correct?" Carrington exhaled, a hiss of disdain. "That's right. It's in his report." Jalen nodded. Slow, deliberate, a chess player sliding a pawn into place. "Of course it is," he said, then turned to Grayson, his gaze a blade pinning the judge to his chair. "Your Honor, I move to dismiss that testimony as evidence." The room jolted, a collective gasp sucking the air dry. Grayson squinted, his fingers tightening on the gavel. "On what grounds?" he demanded. Voice low, a growl. Jalen pulled his hands from his pockets, finally, revealing not fists but precision. Gesturing toward the prosecution's table like a matador taunting a bull. "Because Officer Ruiz never saw me in that car. In fact, he wasn't even on duty when the chase began." The words landed like a thunderbolt, splitting the courtroom's smug certainty in two. Carrington's face twitched, a crack in the mask. "What are you talking about?" he spat. But his voice wavered, a ship taking on water. Jalen stepped closer, relentless. "Your Honor, if the court allows, I request verification of Officer Ruiz's GPS logs from that night. If his report claims he saw me, those logs should match his story." He paused, letting the "but" hang like a guillotine blade. "I have a feeling they won't." The gallery exploded, a cacophony of gasps and mutters. Heads swiveling from Jalen to Carrington to Grayson. The judge's frown deepened, a storm cloud gathering, as he turned to the prosecutor. "Counselor?" Carrington cleared his throat, jaw tight as a vice. Scrambling for footing. "That report was filed by an officer of the law. Your Honor, are we really taking a defendant's word over a professional?" Jalen shrugged. "Casual. Deadly. If Ruiz was where he says he was, the GPS will prove it. But if he wasn't," he let the sentence trail, a fuse burning down to its end. Grayson's eyes narrowed, studying the kid who'd just lit the match. "Does the prosecution object to verifying the logs?" he asked, his tone a razor's edge. Carrington hesitated, one beat too long. A stumble the jury saw. The gallery felt. The judge marked. The room held its breath again, teetering on the brink. "No objections, Your Honor," he muttered, but the words were ash. And everyone knew it. The tide had turned. Jalen stood still, a lone figure in the chaos. And for the first time, the courtroom wasn't laughing, it was trembling. The courtroom quivered, a beast caught mid-roar, as Jalen Dawson tightened his grip on the unraveling threads of the prosecution's case. Mitchell Carrington shuffled his papers, a captain clutching the helm of a sinking ship, his polished facade cracking like glass under a hammer. "Your Honor," he barked, voice taut as a bowstring. While we await the GPS logs, the fact remains, undeniable, unshakable, that the defendant's fingerprints were etched onto the steering wheel of that stolen Audi. The words struck like a volley of arrows, aimed to pin Jalen to the wall, and the gallery shifted, a restless tide lapping at the shore of doubt. On the surface, it was a killing blow, fingerprints. The silent witnesses that never lie. Or so they thought. Jalen nodded, a flicker of acknowledgement, his face a mask carved from stone. That's true, he said, his voice low, a rumble beneath the earth. And then he stepped forward, a lone wolf circling the pack. The room stilled, every breath held hostage, as Grayson raised an eyebrow, his gavel a dormant volcano in his hand. Go on, the judge growled, leaning into the storm. Jalen turned to the jury, his gaze a searchlight cutting through fog, locking onto each pair of eyes with unrelenting precision. The prosecution wants you to swallow a simple story, he said, his words slow, deliberate, a fuse burning toward dynamite. They say my fingerprints mean I stole that car. But let's peel back the lie and look at the truth. He took a deep breath, the air crackling around him, and launched his strike. Imagine you're in a store, trying on a jacket. You slide your hands into the pockets, tug the zipper, feel the fabric, then hang it back and walk away. Hours later, someone snatches it. Are you the thief because your prints are on it? The jurors blinked, glances darting like startled birds. A murmur rippled through the gallery. A stone dropped into still water. Jalen didn't pause. That car was parked outside a 7-Eleven. Hours before it vanished. I was there with friends, laughing, messing around. I leaned against it. Yeah, opened the door. Sure, it was unlocked. Tempting. A dumb kid's curiosity. But I didn't drive it. I didn't steal it. I walked away. His voice sharpened, a blade unsheathed. Does touching something make you a criminal? Carrington lurched forward, papers fluttering like wounded wings. His voice a desperate claw scraping for control. That's a nice tale, Your Honor. But, Jalen cut him off, pivoting like a fencer landing a fatal thrust. Let's talk about those fingerprints. Then, Your Honor, was the forensic specialist who lifted them subpoenaed to testify? The question detonated, a bomb in the silence. Grayson blinked, caught off guard, his glasses slipping as he glanced at Carrington. The prosecutor froze, then stammered, No, Your Honor. But, Jalen pounced, relentless. So the state's betting my life on forensic evidence. But they didn't bother bringing the expert? No chance to cross-examine. To ask how those prints were handled. If the chain of custody held. If the analysis even holds water? The room tilted. A ship struck broadside. Carrington's jaw clenched. A muscle twitching like a cornered animal's. The gallery buzzed. A hive waking to the sting. Grayson pinched the bridge of his nose. A sigh escaping like steam from a cracked pipe. His golf game slipping further from reach. This wasn't the quick kill he'd expected. This was a war. And Jalen was drawing blood. The kid stood there, unyielding, a storm in human form. And the cracks he'd exposed weren't just in the evidence, they were in the room itself. Spreading, splintering, threatening to bring the whole damn house down. He wasn't done yet. The next blow was coming. And it would hit harder. The courtroom trembled on the edge of chaos. A tightrope stretched taut over a chasm. As Jalen Dawson stepped forward once more, his shadow slicing through the flickering light like a blade through flesh. The air crackled, electric with the scent of unraveling lies. And every eye, juror, spectator, judge, locked onto him. A moth to a flame that promised to burn everything down. Your Honor, he said, his voice a low thunder rolling across the horizon. I'd like to enter into evidence an official statement from the owner of the vehicle. The words struck like a lightning bolt, splitting the room's fragile calm in two. Grayson's frown deepened, a crevasse cracking his stony face. The owner? He rumbled, leaning forward, his gavel a poised executioner's axe. Jalen nodded, slow, deliberate, a predator savoring the kill. Yes, Mr. Raymond Whitaker, the man whose Audi was stolen. He gave a statement to the police. When the prosecution buried like a body in the woods. He turned, his gaze piercing Mitchell Carrington, pinning the prosecutor to his chair like a specimen under glass. Do you recall what Mr. Whitaker told officers that night? Carrington's jaw locked, a steel trap snapping shut. His silence screaming what his words wouldn't. He knew the cliff's edge was near. And Jalen was about to shove him over. No answer came. So Jalen took the stage, pulling a printed transcript from his file with the flourish of a magician revealing his final trick. He held it aloft, a banner of truth in a den of deceit, and read aloud, his voice cutting through the room like a siren's wail. I left my car running when I ran inside the gas station. Some kid jumped in and took off, but it wasn't the guy you arrested. I saw him. He was white. A gasp tore through the courtroom. A tidal wave crashing against the walls, drowning the murmurs in a flood of disbelief. Jalen thrust the paper higher. A torch in the dark. That's from the original police report, the one the prosecution pretended didn't exist. He wheeled back to Grayson, his eyes blazing. The arresting officer heard this. The prosecution ignored it, and yet they want this jury to believe I'm guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, me. A black kid who doesn't even match the description of the thief who sped off into the night. Carrington lunged forward, papers scattering like leaves in a storm, his voice a desperate howl. Your Honor, this is irrelevant. The defendant was caught in possession. Jalen cut him off. A guillotine dropping. No, I wasn't. His tone stayed level, a calm that chilled the marrow. But it sliced deeper than any shout. I was arrested blocks away, walking home with snacks, nowhere near that car when they found it abandoned. I wasn't running. I wasn't hiding. The only thing tying me to this is sloppy police work and a story that doesn't hold water. The room imploded, gasps, shouts, the rustle of reporters' pens like a swarm of locusts descending. Grayson exhaled, a slow hiss of a man watching his empire crumble, rubbing his temple as if to ward off the headache Jalen had become. The case wasn't just unraveling, it was a house of cards in a hurricane. And Jalen stood at the eye, unbowed, unrelenting. He turned to the jury, his voice a quiet blade now, piercing their souls. The real thief slipped away that night. The cops nabbed a black kid nearby and called it a day. That's what this is about, assumptions, not evidence. Silence fell, heavy as a shroud, broken only by Grayson clearing his throat, adjusting his glasses with hands that betrayed a tremor. He stared at Jalen, then the jury, then Carrington, who stood rigid, flushed, a statue of a man who'd lost the war before he'd fired his last shot. Does the prosecution have anything further? Grayson asked, his voice a hollow echo. Carrington's, "No, Your Honor," was a whisper. A white flag fluttering in defeat. The gavel hovered, the room teetered, and Jalen stood tall, a spark about to ignite a revolution. The courtroom hung in a fragile, shivering hush, a battlefield after the cannons fall silent. Smoke still curling from the wreckage of a case torn to shreds. Jalen Dawson stood at its center, a lone titan amid the rubble, his quiet defiance a flame that had scorched the prosecution's house of lies to ash. Judge Walter Grayson gripped his gavel, knuckles white as bone, his throne now a perch of uncertainty. The air buzzed with the weight of what had just unfolded, testimony shattered, evidence unraveled, a system laid bare, and every soul in the room felt the tremor of a reckoning. The jury sat rigid, eyes wide like deer caught in a hunter's sights. The gallery teetered on the edge of eruption. A volcano primed to blow. Grayson's gaze bore into Jalen, a storm brewing behind those glasses, searching for a crack in the kid who'd turned his routine slaughter into a war. But Jalen met it, unflinching, a rock against the tide, his hands steady where others trembled. The judge's lips parted, a breath escaping like the hiss of a deflating empire. And then the words fell, sharp, final, a thunderclap splitting the silence. Case dismissed. For a heartbeat, the world froze, a photograph of disbelief etched into every face. Then chaos erupted. Half the room surged to its feet. A tidal wave of gasps and shouts crashing against the walls, some in shock, some in quiet awe, a few in fury. Reporters scrambled, pens slashing notebooks like swords, capturing the moment a titan fell. Jalen didn't move, didn't flinch. He let the storm swirl around him, a statue carved from the ashes of their doubt, savoring the weight of victory as it settled into his bones. Grayson still clutched his gavel, staring down at the kid who'd rewritten the script, his smirk long gone, replaced by something raw, recognition, maybe, or the bitter sting of regret. The old man's eyes lingered, tracing the lines of a boy he'd underestimated, a boy who'd made the system blink first. Jalen turned to leave, hoodie shadowing his face, but Grayson's voice cut through the din like a whip crack. Mr. Dawson. Jalen paused, 1 foot on the threshold of freedom, but didn't look back. The judge hesitated, the air between them taut as a wire. Then spoke again, softer, almost reverent. You should consider law school. A smirk flickered across Jalen's lips, quick as a spark, gone before anyone could catch it. He didn't need to consider it. He was already a blade forged in the fire of this fight. Destined for courtrooms where he'd wield the law like a sword. He stepped forward, the door swinging wide, and the roar of the room faded behind him. The battle was won, but the war? That was just beginning. Outside, the air thrummed with the chaos he'd left in his wake, cameras flashing like gunfire. Reporters swarming the steps, their voices a cacophony of hunger. Did you know he'd dismiss it? What's next? How does it feel to outsmart them all? Jalen pulled his hoodie tighter, a shield against the spotlight, and walked on. This wasn't about glory. It was about the truth he'd clawed from the jaws of a machine that devoured the unwary. And Grayson? He lingered in the emptying courtroom, gavel slack in his hand, staring at the spot where Jalen had stood. The arrogance had bled out of him, leaving a man who'd glimpsed something rare, a spark that could ignite a revolution. This wasn't just a case dismissed. It was a mirror held up to a system that had failed. And for once, it had no choice but to look. The courthouse steps erupted into a maelstrom of light and sound. A battlefield reborn under the relentless assault of flashing cameras and shouting voices. Reporters swarmed like vultures descending on a fresh kill. Their microphones thrust forward like spears. Their questions a barrage of bullets. Jalen, did you know you'd win? What's your next move? How does it feel to dismantle a prosecutor's empire? The air crackled with their hunger, thick with the scent of ink and ambition. But Jalen Dawson moved through it like a shadow through smoke. He pulled his hoodie low, a warrior's cowl shielding him from the glare. His step steady, deliberate, unfazed by the chaos he'd unleashed. This wasn't about their spotlight. It was about the war he'd just begun. At the foot of the steps, Denise Dawson stood waiting, a lighthouse in the storm, her arms crossed tight as if holding herself together against the tide. Her face was a mask, stone-carved with worry, pride, and something fiercer, until her eyes met his. For a heartbeat, time stopped, the clamor fading to a distant hum as mother and son locked gazes. Then she exhaled, a breath that carried years of battles fought in the shadows of courtrooms, and shook her head. "Boy, you scared me half to death," she said, her voice a thread of steel wrapped in warmth. Jalen scratched the back of his head, a sheepish grin breaking through the armor. Had to take a risk. Ma. She stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in, then pulled him into a hug so fierce it could have stopped the world, a fortress of love against the madness still swirling around them. The cameras kept snapping, but Jalen didn't see them. He was already looking past this moment, past the victory, to the fight ahead. Across the street, Judge Walter Grayson lingered by his car, a solitary figure cast in the dying light of a day he'd never forget. The arrogance that once clung to him like a second skin had melted away, leaving a man stripped bare. His posture slumped as if the weight of Jalen's triumph pressed down on his shoulders. His eyes followed the kid, hood up, head high, tracing the path of a force he'd misjudged. This wasn't supposed to happen. Another routine case, another guilty plea, another notch on his gavel, until Jalen turned the table into a guillotine and cut through the system's smug certainty. Now, Grayson stood there, staring into a reflection he couldn't unsee. A mirror held up by a 19-year-old who'd made justice tremble. The lesson clawed its way out of the wreckage, sharp and unyielding. How many others had been crushed under this machine? How many cases sealed not by truth but by bias? Shortcuts. A system that prized closed files over open eyes? Jalen had the mind to fight, the fire to win. But what about the ones who didn't? This wasn't just his story. It was a siren's call echoing through every courtroom, every cell, every life the law had failed. He knew what came next. This wasn't the end, it was the spark. The next time he stood in a courtroom, he wouldn't be in chains. He'd be the one wielding the gavel's power, tearing down the walls brick by brick. And he wouldn't be alone. The air thrummed with the weight of it all as Jalen walked away, Denise at his side, the reporter's cries fading into a distant roar. The system had blinked today. But it wouldn't sleep. Not yet. Not until voices like his forced it awake. Share this tale. Let it burn through the shadows. Hit that like. Subscribe for more. Keep the fire alive, because next time, it might not be Jalen. It might be someone you know. And the fight for truth doesn't stop until the last chain breaks. Thank you for accompanying us in today's story. See you again in the next videos. Hello and see you again.